All right, so today we are going to be looking at yoga philosophy. And so I'm curious to know what any of you might think about what yoga philosophy is or is not. Have you ever heard of yoga philosophy, and maybe what does that mean? You're not expected to know this, by the way. I'm just curious if anyone has any current associations. You put it in the chat box, or you can unmute your mic. Samantha, go ahead.
Like the theories or background of yoga?
Yes, of course, that's like the general understanding of that, of the reference to philosophy. Do you have any specific ideas of what those are? Again, not expected to. I'm just kind of curious. Ella in the chat is saying maybe it's about the purpose and experience of yoga. 100%. So we're going to now get into some of the specifics of what that means. Okay. One of the first things I want to tackle is this concept of what people think of as yoga. All right. Oftentimes my students will come in and say, "Hey, are we doing yoga today?" It's like, well, we do yoga. We practice yoga in one way or another every day. And they say, well, no. I mean, are we going to be like doing like posture? We're going to do like poses and breathing and stuff. And that really sort of illuminates a very common sentiment that people have about yoga, that it's only really this idea of moving into these different postures and maybe or maybe not like a kind of a breathing. Some people have that association, some people don't, okay? So one of the first things I really want to tackle today is that concept as it exists, because that, as you can see from this clever little image, is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, this idea that asana, so asana is Sanskrit word for poses, and so this idea that that's all there is to it is not the case. All right, so that's one of the first things. So if you think that poses and maybe breathing techniques are it, then that's really only 2 of 8 other limbs. All right, or 2 of 8 total limbs. Now, it's also important to acknowledge the fact that the 8 limbs of yoga are not the only aspect to it. And for whatever reason, maybe it's just an oversimplification, but a lot of teachers really just focus on the 8 limbs of yoga as being really the entire summary of yoga philosophy. Now, it does have significant elements, don't get me wrong, but it's not all there is to it. So if we look at this again, we see that poses and breathing are just 2 of the 8 limbs of yoga. So it's only 25% of the total. And that total is not just with 8 limbs, right? So it's even bigger than that. So it's a kind of a percentage, if you will. All right. So that's one of the things I want you to start off with the understanding of. First, that yoga is much more than just poses and breathing. Secondly, that these 8 limbs are not all there is to the larger philosophy. Okay. So that's kind of the first thing that if you take anything away from today's lecture, that's it. Before we go on from this slide, I do want to point out the word Ashtanga. You may remember it when we talked about sun salutation A and sun salutation B, right? Because those come from the lineage, the style, or the brand that is called Ashtanga Yoga. Now, the guy who started that, Pattabhi Jois, you can see his name right there on the screen. When he was deciding what to call his style, he chose this word Ashtanga. Now, he was clearly inspired by what was in the Yoga Sutras, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But there isn't an extra authority to his style because of that association. All right. It's just the name that he chose. So instead of it calling it Jois Yoga, he decided to call it Ashtanga Yoga. I want to point that out so there's no confusion. Hopefully that worked. Now, when we talk about yoga philosophy, we're going to really try to look at the Yoga Sutras. Now, sometimes there's too much emphasis put on the Yoga Sutras because they're the oldest text. I want to acknowledge that. However, we got to start somewhere. And so we're going to look at what was the first written down proof we have of this philosophy. Okay. And this came from a long time ago. So approximately that little wavy line in front of 1700, that kind of gives you this approximately about 1700 years ago is the time frame we're dealing with. Not, I don't, no one who's alive now was alive then, so we don't have any firsthand testimony in terms of what was actually going on. So we're just trying to jigsaw things together, which is another point that I want to make. If you're ever talking to someone who's like, absolutely, this is how it was, it's a really long time ago. So you have to kind of throw a red flag up and be like, yeah, that's what we know, but there might be more to the story than that. But at the same time, it is helpful to start to work with what we know. Now, the Yoga Sutras, it's written in sutra form, okay? And this is a style that was very common at the time. And what it does is it boils down the concepts into the shortest possible amount of words. Even though we have proof of written manuscripts of the Yoga Sutras, like I said, around about 300 to 500 Common Era, there wasn't like a printing press situation. So this wasn't like being copied off, right? The existence of manuscripts doesn't mean they were readily available. And so to pass this information along, you had to memorize it. Therefore, making it short, making it concise was really helpful in memorizing, okay? Now, because of that, there isn't a long explanation of each concept. And this leaves it open to interpretation, all right? And to that end, there are many interpretations. Now, most of them are fairly similar, but it's really helpful to know that there is some dispute on what's what. Over the millennia, there have been commentaries. So this is very common with sutra style texts, is that people would then read that and interpret it and write at length in terms of what this stuff meant. There's even inconsistencies in commentaries, okay? So again, we really want to take a critical look at what everyone has to say and then what we think about it when we start to try to derive meaning. Some people consider this Yoga Sutras to be one of the first texts on psychology because it pertains to how we work with the mind, how we perceive our reality, and then we maybe refine that. So hopefully you're starting to get this idea of what was going on at the time, and also that it's not so cut and dry, but we're going to do our best to make some sense of it. Now, I already mentioned this. The 8 limbs are just one part of a bigger text, okay? The 8 limbs are oftentimes focused on the major aspect, okay? And it's significant, but it's not the only one. All right, so I want to acknowledge that, but because it is given so much emphasis, it's worth talking about. All right, let's see what there is, because it is a significant aspect of what's in the Yoga Sutras. So here are the lists of 8 limbs or 8 points that are within the Yoga Sutras. And we'll talk about what all of these mean, because I'm sure you're looking at them without a clue at the moment. So I do want to point out that they move from gross to subtle. And I don't mean gross like, ew, that's disgusting. I'm talking about like the physical, like the obvious. Okay, so like very tangible, like things, and then moving to things that are a little bit more harder to pin down. Okay, you might think of this like physical, mental, and emotional. So physical is very gross. It's obvious. You could see it. You could touch it, right? Mental is it's a little bit less tangible, but still you make sense of it. Emotional can be really hard to kind of pin down as to sort of the meaning of that. So that's a little bit more subtle. So that's kind of another example of going from gross to subtle. All right. The first of the 8 limbs is yamas, or this is kind of your relationship you have with the world. You can think of this as almost like the ethical considerations for how you live your life. Now, the yamas were taken word for word in the exact same order from an older text, a text that came about I want to say about 500 years before the Yoga Sutras, called the Acharanga Sutra. And that is the foundational text for Jainism. All right. So I point this out so you can start to understand that yoga philosophy pulled from different worldviews. It pulled from different philosophies that already existed. All right. And Jainism is one of them. And this is like a very clear connection. Now, within these yamas, there's 5. All right. So this is still the first limb, but there's 5 categories of this. So of the ethics that you have with the world, the first one is ahimsa, or this non-violence, non-harming, or put in a positive sense, just kindness. Now, sometimes we tend to think about harming as just like that physical harm, but it doesn't specifically limit to just that. This is also harming with words, or even in a modern sense, like what we do online and how that might harm other people. It's also not specific to just humans. All right, how you maybe treat other creatures on this planet and the planet itself. So those of you who are environmentalists will happy to know that this is not exclusive to how we deal with each other as humans, but also the planet. Satya. Satya is this idea of truthfulness, but also appropriate honesty. I want you to think about what does that mean to you? Like appropriate honesty. Have you ever heard someone say kind of a hard truth and then they follow it up with saying something like to protect themselves? Like, well, what? It's true, isn't it? Like they're basically they're essentially harming someone typically, using the umbrella of truth to sort of like protect themselves from any wrongdoing. And this is our first example of how these can kind of work together. So just because something's true doesn't mean you have to say it, especially if it harms someone else. Does that make sense? So that's really important to think. There's a kind of a couple, there's a sort of 3-pronged check. It's like, first, is it true? And not just true to you as like your opinion, but is it true? Second, is it kind? And the third is it appropriate to say it at that moment? So that's some nice ways to think about working with satya, or truth. Asteya is non-stealing. This, of course, we know that we shouldn't steal someone else's wallet, right? Or we shouldn't plagiarize. We shouldn't steal someone else's words. But we can also think about this as time, right? Maybe you're always late. You're always like, you say you're going to meet someone at 12 o'clock and you don't show up until 12:30. And you might be able to justify this action in your own head. But if you start to think about it as, wow, I just stole 30 minutes of that person's time, maybe you'll, rethink your own actions and be there. And that's a little bit extreme. I get you. But at the same time, it's true. It's like you have limited that person's ability to do things in that half hour. Hopefully they made good use of their time while they were waiting, but maybe start to reconsider. Brahmacharya, okay, brahmacharya is sexual restraint. So when this text is written, make no mistake about it, this is celibacy. This is refraining from any sexual act at all, and using that energy from your sex drive and channeling that to your efforts towards yoga. All right. Now, that isn't necessarily realistic for everyone, especially if you're a householder or if you have a family or you're wanting to have a family. Other people, sort of in a modern sense, tend to read this as sexual responsibility. So first of all, I want you to understand that it comes from a place, its original intent was celibacy. However, like I said, now it sometimes gets sort of diluted maybe a little bit into sexual responsibility. However, that's still really important. And as just a quick sort of public service announcement, for those of you who are considering becoming sexually active or are sexually active, I really want to take pause and consider the sacredness of that. And to really make sure that you are communicating with your partner on an emotional level and really considering all the possibilities that might come from that, right? Because it could create another human being, and that's like a really big deal. And even if you're engaging in activity that won't result in another human being. There's still a level of intimacy and sacredness that should be completely honored and respected, and that you should be readily and regularly communicating around that. So I just wanted you to consider that, because, you know, this is a time in life where that might come up. And if you're not sexually active, you're not interested in it, that's great too. Aparigraha. Okay, aparigraha oftentimes is thought about this idea of non-hoarding, not being like, you know, it's mine, you cannot have any, you know, type of thing, right? But this is common. This is sort of like a principle of our economic reality right now. You know, a lot of people believe that that is how you succeed in life or how you succeed in business, regardless of how it affects other people. So yoga philosophy would say, nah, that's not how you do things. Another interpretation of this, or it's one that kind of connects with it, is non-attachment. So graha is this idea of grasping or holding on to something. So non-hoarding, or like trying to keep all your wealth to yourself or something like that, would be a physical manifestation of that. A mental and emotional one is not like holding on to like results or attaching on to like ideas, in terms of something to consider. So here we see this idea. It's like these 5 things that are part of the first limb that really set forth an economic framework, an ethical framework. And through that ethical framework, it sets a foundation for what's to come. So even though you might not perfect all of these things, and this is something you can sort of just think about right now as you see that list, like what are some of the things that you naturally do well? What are some of the things that you maybe need to bring a little bit more attention into your life? But by and large, this is setting your foundation for how you're going to progress through this system. The next step goes from how you treat the world around you, others and other animals in the environment, with now like how you treat yourself. Okay, the Neomas. And again, there's 5 of these. First one is Soka, the cleanliness or purity. So this is kind of like, if I interpret the world through this vehicle that is my physical body, I want to keep it clean. I want to keep it as efficient as possible. It's like if you were locked in a room and the only way you can interpret the world was through a window, you wouldn't let it all get all grimy and dirty because you couldn't see out of it. So, you want to keep it clean so you can, kind of figure out what's going on. Santosha is a huge one. This is one of my favorites, and I think that this is really the anecdote, or an anecdote for, or antidote, not anecdote, antidote for kind of the modern living or the modern dynamic. I think that consumer culture that we are deeply steeped into will do 2 things. It'll try to make you desire things that you don't need, and it'll try to make you fear things that you shouldn't be afraid of. And the reason that they do that is to then sell you something that will alleviate that desire or alleviate that fear. So if you can really start to work with this concept of contentment, which I think is really closely connected with gratitude, where you're recognizing, you know what? I appreciate what I have. Okay, maybe I want more, or maybe I'm not attached to that concept of wanting more, but there's maybe some more. So I'm not necessarily complacent, but I'm grateful and I'm content with what is in this moment. And that concept, and it's very simple, really, I think is a key towards mental health. Tapas, you might have seen this word in a Spanish appetizer context, but in Sanskrit, it's more this idea of refining your habits. And there's oftentimes there's heat associated here, because this idea that we can like burn off these impurities. So it's not easy to refine our habits, our diet, or to exercise. But in doing so, we create a more efficient vehicle for ourselves. Svahaja is this idea of self-study, reflection. So how do I know if I'm being appropriately honest? How do I recognize if I'm stealing someone else's time or energy and attention? Well, I have to kind of reflect on that, honestly. And by doing so, I realized, oh, you know what? I just had kind of been doing that, and I wasn't really critically thinking about it. And now I recognize that I maybe need to refine that with the tapas, right? So you can kind of see how all of these things can kind of work together and interrelate. Ishvara Pranidhana can be a controversial one, and so I really want to be clear about this. Ishvara is a very general term. It doesn't specify anything particularly. But what it's essentially saying, as I understand it, is that if you have a worldview that includes a greater power, like an unseen entity, something that's maybe governing our universe, then you can actually dedicate your efforts towards that. It's not specific, it's really inclusive, but if that is a part of your experience with reality, then you're welcome to channel that in that direction. And in fact, it can be very effective. Okay? If you're not into that concept, by no means can you just, oh, well, this isn't for me. No, that's fine. You dedicate your action to something that's outside of yourself, whatever that might be in a tangible form. All right, now, asana, the poses, all right? There's only one small mention of this in the Yoga Sutras. And actually, the word asana can also mean seat. So there's people who firmly believe that that's all he meant. Patanjali was just talking about taking a seated position for meditation. All right. Now, as time went on, as yoga philosophies became incorporated or appropriated or co-opted by other traditions, especially ones that really use the physical body to explore their reality, the idea of movement and embodied poses became more significant. All right. So it's hard to say in Patanjali's sutras how important physical posture was. Over time, this became much more important. And then when we get to post-colonial times and physical culture is starting to become sort of a global phenomenon, this is where I think the influence of what yoga is as pose dominant really takes over. And if you look at the different names for yoga poses, they end with this word asana. All right. So if you've ever thought, what's the Sanskrit name for downward facing dog? Well, it's that last one there, Adho Mukha Svanasana. But you can see the first one is mountain, the second one is forward fold, or I think it's intense stretch. I think the actual interpretation. But you see asana at the very end. Okay, on to the next limb. Everyone doing okay so far? Anyone have any questions? And if something else comes up at a later time, you can always email me, all right? But I'm here for you. Now, when we talk about prana, all right, we are talking about life force, essentially. So it's not just breath work. That's a common translation for pranayama is breathing practices, okay? And there's also this kind of manipulation of your breath and your inner pressure systems to create different results, okay? The one pranayama that we have practiced in this class so far is ujjayi breath. So by restricting our throat, by making a sound, we are restricting the intake and the pushing out of breath. And we're also creating a sound to help us sort of focus. So by using this particular technique, we're also changing the energetic feel, all right? Prana can also be like in food you eat. You can think about it in terms of like there's more prana in an apple that you just get from a tree versus, packaged apple slices from Subway that are in a refrigerator, Still good, right? I still would prefer the apple slices over flaming hot Cheetos, but that apple from the tree has a little bit more life force in this theory. You might also understand prana by another word called chi, where like qigong, tai chi, concepts in acupuncture also work with this. Now, those first four, right? Now we're starting to get more toward the subtler stuff. So the concept here is that if everything that I can interpret with my senses is all subject to change, can anyone think of an exception to that? Does anyone know of anything that doesn't ever change? Sometimes it might take a while to change. Sometimes it changes very quickly. But in the end, everything in our physical world is subject to change, right? It's kind of like sort of a little bit of a oxymoron. It's like the only thing that stays the same is change. You can think about that later. But because that's the case, we maybe want to see if we can connect to something that doesn't change. Now, yoga philosophy puts forth the concept, and you don't have to believe this, you don't have to adhere to it, but I'm just kind of giving it to you how I'm getting it, is that you have this, okay? You have life. Life is changing, life's doing its thing, it's doing its dance, right? So this hand is life. This hand is your consciousness, your awareness, your ability to watch this dance of life, okay? And yoga philosophy, which is really essentially pulls on something called Samkhya philosophy, puts forth the concept that these things are separate. Your awareness does not change. Life, reality, physical world, always changing, okay? What it says is that the problem is that your awareness gets here and it gets caught up in all the changes stuff and it thinks it's the same thing. It's like, oh, this is changing. Oh, this is good. Oh, this is bad. It changed and all this kind of thing. Point is to say, oh no, your awareness can be back here and watch all of that. So one way to kind of help us as a tool to kind of get us out of this, getting caught in the net of life is to take our senses inward. Close our eyes, close our ears, right? I talk about this in some of our practices. So by shutting off some of these senses, you start to draw within to try to connect to this awareness, or what's called Purusha in Sanskrit in terms of philosophy. So a lot of people will think about this as like a turtle drawing its senses in. No smell, no sight, no touch, just like shutting off to those things. The next step on this then is going into concentration and focus. All right. So I talk a lot about this, whether it's focusing on how you place your body or how you breathe. We'll eventually start to get into still meditation instead of the moving meditation that we've been doing. And you can choose various objects for this. It could be a picture of a loved one. It could be a glass of water. It could be a candle. Right? There's all different sort of things that you can focus on, or just simply your breath or sensations in your body. But working on this focus is going to set up something bigger. And this seventh limb is dhyana, or like meditation. This is where now I have chosen a focus of my concentration and I'm really starting to watch what happens with my awareness, how often it wants to get into that net. And then I have to draw it back out, right? And then it pulls back in. And there goes a thought. Oh, I'm going over here. Oh, wait, whoosh, come back, So this is sort of the process of meditation. And then you start to get where you're like, okay, I'm really connecting. And then maybe you just see that one thing that you're focused on and you're seeing it in its stillness, right? And then from there, you go into the last limb, which is like this deep immersion where it's just like, you are locked in. And when you're locked in and when you have this sense of immersion in that experience, it starts to become clear to you that this stuff is different than this thing. And when you can do that, that's that discriminative discernment that you see on your screen. When you can do that, that is the point. That is what you're going towards. So the more you practice and you can get into this deep immersion, the closer you are to understanding this reality that there's life and there's awareness. And the more you can understand that those two things are separate, the more you're moving towards non-suffering and the more you're moving towards yoga. And there it is. So to recap, when it comes to yoga, it's much more than just poses and breathing techniques. That's number one. Second thing, the 8 limbs of yoga, which are commonly referred to as the only aspect of yoga philosophy, are just a part of something a bit bigger. All right. Lastly, there's this concept of essentially dualism. All right. There's the world, there's reality, and then there's consciousness. Those things are separate. And again, you don't have to agree with this. You don't have to fully subscribe to it. I just want you to understand it as it comes from the source text. Now, I referred earlier to the fact that some traditions have taken that and run with it in different directions. Nothing wrong with that. But it's really important that we understand when that's happening. Like, for instance, samadhi. Some people will take samadhi as not just a deep immersion with meditation, but actually an immersion with like what they believe to be like the creator of the universe, right? And that's valid. Like, that's their experience. However, that's not specific to the Yoga Sutras. That is a way that it's been interpreted through a lens of their tradition. And that's one of the cool things about the Yoga Sutras, in my opinion. It really allows for you to take what's personal to you and run with the framework in terms of reducing your suffering and seeing things as they are. So again, I hope you enjoyed today. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'd love to keep this dialogue going, and we'll continue to re-explore this as we go.